All right. Good evening. It is Wednesday, July the 12th at 6:30, and I'd like to go ahead and call this special city council meeting to order. If we could go ahead and call roll, please.
Mitchell, Tobias,
Present.
Heiser,
Present.
Flores-Kell,
Here.
Zuniga,
Present.
Bradshaw, Parsley.
Here.
Okay, looks like we have a quorum of 5. And at this time, should we go ahead and go ahead and open up to the Planning and Zoning Commission? Commissioner Ackerman?
Thank you. Okay, good evening. The time is 6:31 p.m. It's on. My mic is on. Good evening. No, just kidding. The time is 6:31 p.m. Today is Wednesday, July 12th. I will now call the special called meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Delory.
Here.
Mata.
Here.
Onken.
Here.
Stiegel.
Here.
James.
Here.
Chase.
Fabulous. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Noting 5 members present, we have established a quorum as well.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we're going to go ahead and open up for citizens' comments. This is an opportunity for anybody in the audience to come forward and speak about anything on the agenda item, anything related to city business and planning and zoning. And at this time, do we have anybody signed up for speaking? Okay, going to go ahead and open it up for citizens' comment. Seeing that we have none, I'm going to go ahead and close it. All right, the next item up on the agenda is going to be the discussions between planning and zoning commissions and city council and facilitation with Verdunity and the city comprehension planning firm regarding implementation strategies for the City of Kyle 2030 comprehension plan update. And this is Will Atkinson.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Will Atkinson for the record, Planning Director. I'll keep it short. So before you, we have Verdunity, we have AJ and Marshall, and they are going to be doing the presentation tonight for implementation strategies.
Can everyone hear me okay?
We don't have any.
How about now?
Do we have a screen?
Got it. All right. Well, good evening to all of you. We are excited to be back with you this evening. Sure.
I'm seeing it on my computer, so for me.
Are you logging into Ring Central and having issues, or are you experiencing issues? I just don't see it online.
We just don't see it on the monitors when we're seeing it either.
But yes, on the there is a live feed going on the website for sure.
It may just, I just don't think the slides have shown up just yet.
Okay, we were just trying to verify it so that way if those who are watching would be able to see and hear it. Thank you. Okay, looks like we are live. Okay. All righty, well, thank you. Appreciate it, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Excellent, of course. So this evening, we are, as promised, going to speak with you all about the implementation strategy component of the comprehensive plan. We don't plan to take up too much of your time this evening. We'll try to move fairly swiftly through this. So we want to give you some introductory information. We have an exercise that we'll work through with all of you. And so we're going to start, as we always do, by just reminding you where we are in the project timeline process, which you can see on the slide here. We have just finished, and with this trip are wrapping up the 3rd phase of this plan and moving into the prioritization phase, which is phase 4 of the plan, which will carry us through August. This we want to pause on for a moment and just draw everyone's attention to that's watching and that's in attendance, because this is a notable part of this timeline. And why is that notable? Well, the reason it's notable is because you will be receiving a document to review very soon. And I know you've all been eagerly anticipating that. You've been very patient through this process, and we appreciate that. You'll be receiving the final draft in 2 different forms. The first piece of that is going to be the plan draft itself, which you'll be receiving, will be turning over to the city by the end of the month. And the second piece of that is what we're going to work on with you all tonight, which is the implementation strategy component of the plan. So it's 2 elements that together will formulate the final document. And again, as a reminder, we will be meeting with you all one final time throughout the 5th phase from September to October to adopt the plan formally. So we'll be working with your staff to coordinate the draft delivery. They will be working with you all to do a review of those drafts and to coordinate the different edit collections, providing those back to us, and then we'll be putting together a final draft for you. So we're getting very, very close. So what is our time going to be spent on tonight? Well, we're going to talk about implementation, and we wanted to start with just reminding you about the approach that we typically take to the implementation process. There's really 2 major components of it. It's incremental in nature, and it is neighborhood-centric. And what does that really mean? Well, when we're talking about an incremental approach to implementation, what we are talking about is something that uses a series of small, achievable, attainable steps. It is something that is a culture that you create of experimentation, where you try some new things, you experiment with some different ideas, test things to see how they work. It's a very important process because it is a slight paradigm shift for cities that takes us from a place of making sure that we are open to idea generation, as that means coming from our citizens, as that means coming from all of you, and that we are testing those ideas and creating low barriers for people to come forward and share their thoughts. That helps you to achieve more with less in many ways, which is often what government is challenged with doing. It also enables you to have a lower sense of risk when you're trying to test some different ideas. And you'll find throughout this process that your public has been very forthcoming with some ideas of their own that they'd like you to try. And we're going to talk about some of the different categories of ideas that you'll be seeing. The other big element that's really important is that it's very neighborhood-centric and neighborhood-focused. Great neighborhoods make great communities, and we've talked with you all at length about the importance of neighborhoods and making sure that they offer a variety of things that serve the people that live and work within those neighborhoods. So this plan focuses on this idea of a collective ownership of the plan. The plan doesn't belong to City Hall, nor does it belong simply to the citizens. It belongs to all of you as a whole. And the way that you create that idea of collective ownership is by making sure that people can see themselves and their ideas reflected in the ultimate plan that you adopt. Another element that's really important to this is understanding the amount of resources that you have in your community. In government, we often have to get very creative because there's never enough resources to do everything that we would like to do. And what we have found in most communities, and Kyle has been no exception to this, is that cities typically have a great wealth of resources already at their disposal. They may not be as well connected as they might like to be. They may not be fully aware of one another, but they're often there and they're often present. And so one of the things that we did this week was work with your community to identify those resources so that we can show you how to incorporate them in the carrying out and implementation of the plan. So a big part of the implementation is the recommendations that we're going to bring to you. And what we try to do in our approach that you saw when you selected us to do this work is we try to take a little bit different tack when we're looking at recommendations than what you might typically see in comprehensive plans. Recommendations and comprehensive plans are generally very broad and overarching recommendations, and that's where it stops. That doesn't quite get you where you need to go because it leaves you in a position where over the first year after adoption, you're trying to decipher those broad recommendations and you're trying to define them and determine how to carry those out. And so there's a great deal of excitement that's built about the adoption of the plan, and that excitement is often dampened whenever we can't set to work right away. And so what we've tried to do in this effort is to do the opposite, to give you those broad, meaningful recommendations, but correlate them into a series of specific actions that you can carry out starting from the moment you adopt the plan, so that you really get to work as soon as possible. And the actions together are very important, because if you complete all of the actions, think of them as a to-do list for each recommendation, then the recommendation itself will be largely fulfilled. It will require some re-examination from time to time, and we're going to talk about how you will essentially take this plan and make it your own and continue to update it over time. But there are some specific things that are important for actions to contain and to encompass, and that's what we're going to work with you all tonight and have you come up with some of these actions for us. So some of the things that are really important here is that they are, as I've already mentioned, very specific. They're things that are achievable. They're things that are phrased in a way where you as a council, as a commission, and as the city as a whole can report on those things. The public's going to be very interested in understanding how you've put this plan into motion, and the best way for you to be able to let them know how that's working and what successes that you've experienced is by having a series of actions where it's very easy for you to report whether or not they've been accomplished. They also have to be realistic for the constraints within which you're working. And so you've helped us really get a good handle on the constraints that you've experienced and how they've influenced the work that you're doing. There's also a series of action types that will be part of the plan. And so when we give you the final product, you will see these broad recommendations. You'll see the specific actions that take you towards achieving that recommendation. We'll suggest the different city departments and partners in the community that can be part of carrying out those actions. And we'll suggest the kinds of actions that are necessary and warranted by those different actions. So here's the different categories that you'll tend to see. And the first two, I think, are the ones that are the ones that come to mind for most of us. When we think about setting a plan into action, we think about utilizing regulations to set the boundaries and the standards of the community. We also tend to think of the capital investments that we need to make in order to carry that plan forward. But there are other elements that are important action types to include as well. So one of the things that you'll see throughout the plan that ties back to this idea of incremental neighborhood-centric is the tactical/community actions. These are really areas where the city makes possible the ability for locals to participate in the plan execution on their own. Essentially, sometimes the city will say, we really should maybe get out of the way and let people run with this and see where they go. You'll decide where that's necessary and where that's appropriate, but that is something that you're seeing more and more with cities. It also, again, gives you the ability to experiment before making large capital investments to see if something is going to work well for your community and get buy-in before those purchases and investments are made, which makes your lives a lot easier, right? Because you get a lot of hard questions about those. Partnerships are also critical to this idea of neighborhood-centric incremental implementation. Those resources that I mentioned at the outset that we're putting together an inventory of using your community as kind of a litmus test of what groups could be part of this, where and when they should be incorporated. And those partnerships help you to do more with less as well. Often we find with the different clients we work with that there are community partnerships that can give them access to additional funding, to additional expertise that you may not have on staff, ideas and introductions that help you work more effectively and get things done. Education and communication will also be an important type of action. You've all already indicated how important public engagement is for you. And so to keep this conversation going outside of the initial planning process, to maintain this two-way dialogue that citizens tend to value and place more trust in their government with, education and communication is really key to that. And you are already identifying ways through the budget process that you're currently under discussions about on several of these items, including the education piece. Guidelines and incentives are two other tools that we recommend that you use in combination with regulations. Regulations are very helpful with some areas that you want to focus on, but it's also important to guide people in the direction that you'd like them to go, to provide them the resources and the knowledge base to bring you the sorts of things that you're wanting to see, and to incentivize them. And incentives, typically we think of that as being money, some sort of financial contribution or access to some sort of financial account or program, but it can also be a process incentive, making sure that we make the process as streamlined as possible for the sorts of development, for example, that you'd like to see in your community. So next, we're going to walk you very quickly through some examples of things that you're going to see in the implementation strategy. The first reason we're going to do this is because when you get it, we want it to feel familiar to you. We want you to know what you can expect when you have your hands on this. And secondly, we want to show you some examples so that when we walk you through this exercise in a moment, you can base the way that you approach that exercise based on what you've seen here. So there's 3 different areas that were encompassed in the scope of this project. Number 1 is sort of general overarching recommendations, things that are associated with governing the city. We're also going to look at some recommendations that are specific to neighborhoods, which we've spent a lot of time talking with you about. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about recommendations that are specific to land use and growth management. So in the first example here, the recommendation generally is to align decisions with the community's principles. This is something that we got a lot of positive feedback on from the community. Back in Trip 1, you may remember us sharing with you that one of the exercises that we walked the community through was telling us what sorts of principles specifically they'd like to see incorporated in decision making. So we know that that's an important thing for people in Kyle. So there's a variety of ways that we can do that. We can do that by showing how the decisions that we are making align with our priorities, as in number 1. In number 3, we define what our standards are. So everyone in the community is familiar with them. They understand what that bar is and how they are able to reach that bar. Number 5 is another example. We administer ways to let citizens communicate with us and let us know how they feel about the different governing decisions that we're making. So these are some examples of some of those actions that you can take. The next set of recommendations that we're going to talk about briefly are focused on land use and growth management. And I do want to pause here for a moment to say, I know that this is a very short list, and I assure you the list that you'll be getting is anything but short. We obviously are still working on the overall implementation strategy, and this trip is really paramount in formalizing and finalizing the elements that we'll recommend to you. So keep in mind that this is but a very small sample of what you'll be seeing. So when it comes to land use and growth management, one of the recommendations that's evolved and emerged from this process is that we want to encourage a development pattern that preserves green spaces. We had a really good conversation with you all about this in both Trip 3 and Trip 4, where you gave us some feedback on how green space paired with different types of development patterns and housing types could or might not fit in Kyle, where those things could and might not fit. So there's a variety of ways, for example, that we could come at the encouragement of preservation of green space. We can use data to do this. We can identify those areas that need to be preserved and make sure that we're tracking those and that they're part of our conversations and considerations as a number 1. And number 2, we can protect those areas through that regulatory action that we talked about earlier. We may also be able to pair that with the idea of using guidelines to preserve those areas. Another example is in number 4, where we update the Parks and Trails Master Plan, something you've already started talking about, but that's obviously key to the preservation of green spaces, and incorporating the Vibe Trail, which is a very important project for the community, in that discussion and process and finalizing and formalizing its delineation. So these are a few examples that if you implement them and check those off, you will be working towards that development pattern that's preserving green space. The third recommendation we'll show you as an example is a neighborhood-specific recommendation, and it is to support the creation of complete and cohesive neighborhoods throughout the city. Now, you all have given us some very specific feedback on what complete neighborhoods mean for you. And some of the things that we've also heard from the community that we got some feedback on last night and yesterday afternoon include this desire to have a policy where streets are welcoming to multiple different modes of transportation. Whether you're biking, walking, or driving, you have the ability to actually get from place to place, and there's a connected network. Another way that you can do this is to empower your local neighborhoods to be part of the process, to identify those neighborhoods, to give them and recognize their identity that they currently have, and formalize that through the naming of those neighborhoods and building a program where neighborhoods can advocate for themselves effectively and have a more clear line of communication with the city. That's another way to get us to cohesion and completeness in neighborhoods. Another example in number 4 is to take the plan's place types, which you all gave us lots of feedback on in trips 2 and 3, where we talked about what a traditional neighborhood component looked like and how those types of places are ones that you'd like to replicate in the city. So to carry that forward, it will be necessary to review the proposals coming before you to make sure they conform with that place type. These are all examples of ways that you can support the creation of complete and cohesive neighborhoods.
Can I ask something?
Of course you can.
Will, I sent a question about I had sent a question after doing some research on how to integrate or incorporate the prevention of food deserts in neighborhoods and communities. I think that would be equally valuable as we are developing our plans here to not just protect our green space and have a sense of a great neighborhood, but also minimize or reduce the propensity of having those food deserts as part of our plan and strategy as we are a growing city. Would that be something that Verdunity could weave into the comprehensive guidance?
That could certainly be an action in the plan, is to look at doing some research on that, to potentially look at some policy recommendations that you might make as a group. That's certainly something that could be included. We don't have food deserts as a major component of the plan
Right.
because it's outside the scope of where we started, but that is a great example of an idea where it's not something you could implement overnight, but there are specific elements to that you could break up. You could start by looking at seeing what some other similar cities have done in regards to that issue and talk with them about their experience. You could then have the staff maybe put together an outline of what that type of policy could look like here locally. There are different steps within that you certainly could do. You could host a workshop. There's several different things that you could do. So I think that's actually a really good example of something that over time, as you begin to iterate, check things off, and update your plan, you're going to continue to generate these ideas. And I just jotted that down. So as we're putting the draft together, we will see where we can fit that into it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Just real quick, do you mind going back over number 2 on solicit input on neighborhood identification and naming?
Neighborhood. Next
Right
one.
here. We're in the same.
Yeah.
that-
Like
that's
street
number
names? Is this about street names?
No, number 2.
No, number 2, conduct a series of listening sessions to solicit input on neighborhood identification and naming.
Yeah.
And again, tonight we're using these as examples for you, so you will be getting a final version of this to wordsmith and give information on, but was your question about what we're looking for there?
Yeah.
So what we find often with clients that we've worked with is that there are certain neighborhoods and cities that may be very well organized, for example, through an HOA or some other formalized organization, or sometimes an informal, but you don't necessarily see all neighborhoods in city represented in that same way. And so the idea here is to have this through a program-wide approach where all neighborhoods have that same level of formalization and opportunity to be identified, to plug into the city and their information network, to receive information about things that are happening in or adjacent to their neighborhood. This is a suggestion that came up also through this process as accompanying often the comment of an increased transparency. That was one that we heard a lot. So this is speaking to that as well, providing a direct conduit from the city to neighborhoods so that they feel that they're getting better, more accurate, and more timely information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question for number one. When you talk about multimodal transportation options, are you guys gonna include a list of like different options for the city to use as far as mobility goes? Because we have a significant amount of retail coming, and I think the concern is we may not have enough employees, especially if they're young kids. You have to be 18 years old to Uber. You're supposed to be technically to have an account. So my concern is how would we get these jobs filled if we only rely on one type of transportation?
So that's not going to be a problem that the plan will solve, but the investigation of how to make Kyle more accessible through different transportation modes will absolutely be a theme that you'll see, because that too is one that we have heard regularly from your residents. All good questions.
I had another follow-up.
Okay.
This might be more for P and Z, but I know the discussion has been brought up a lot between myself and Councilmember Tobias about looking at our city as northeast, southeast, northwest, southwest.
As
Just
regions.
Because there's a lot of confusion when things come up to the dais and we don't know where exactly it's located. So would we be better serving ourselves through this while we think about our growth and our new roads, if we all sort of collectively started speaking about northeast, southeast, things like that, because sometimes we just don't know where's the development at, where's this road? And I mean, is it something we need to start kind of considering? Even Will, if you want to chime in on that.
If I
As we
could-
grow, as we have more signs, and as we have more new people in the city, you tell them, oh, Public Safety Center, it's over there at Plum Creek. And they're like, well, Plum Creek, is that part of Six Creeks? Is that part of Cypress Forest? And we even have long-term residents that have those questions. So,
And to follow up, if you don't mind, what we had discussed was, are we at the point now on how fast our city is growing? Should we look at it in a different lens as far as like regions?
right.
Like Southeast Kyle, Northeast Kyle. Like when people talk about the hospital, you know, I'm already looking at that as East Central. And HEB, where the PAC Center is, that is West Central, West Central. And because I think it also comes into the confusions when we're talking about Goforth Road, you know, we're like, no, that's not what it was. And we're talking about the one by Beebe Road. And we're like, oh, that area, you know.
So I think you'll
We're
find that
we're looking at regions of the
Yes.
city
Right.
to help identify.
and there's a
it.
familiarity, and
Yeah,
everyone refers
familiarity
to
of
it the
this
same
area
way.
and so
I think
forth.
you'll
No
find
matter.
that the neighborhood item that we talked about a minute ago actually falls right in line with that, because the idea is if everyone knows what an area is, we all use the same vernacular when we talk about it. We all know where it is. We become familiar with our cities in a way that we weren't before. So I think you'll find that recommendation will actually help you with what you're talking about, which is being very clear about where areas are, how we refer to them, where they're located, building that recognition within your community where everyone knows what you're talking about when you use this label or that label, et cetera, and having the neighborhoods be part of that process. I think you'll find that that'll be very well represented.
I think we could even go so far as to have a GIS tool that just outlines different neighborhoods or regions, as you said.
Okay, so that's a great
And,
example of a specific action, right? That is something that falls within that recommendation. So you guys are already on the right track, which is great. Well, let's take us into this is a great segue into the exercise that we want to walk through with you. And we won't belabor this too much, but I'm going to ask Marshall to come up and assist me with like this. And what we want to do here is to help you walk through the process that we're walking through for a couple of different reasons. Again, we want you to have a feeling of expectation when you receive the draft and a sense of familiarity of what you're getting. So it's not any surprise the format it takes, and you can understand what went into those recommendations. I find too often if people don't understand where the recommendations come from, it's very hard to identify with them and kind of own them. And so we go through this process, and the draft that you'll see, what we're about to do, we've done over and over and over on every single one of these suggestions. So we've put some Post-its out on the table and some markers, and if you'll just grab a couple of sheets, we're going to just give you those to jot your thoughts down on as we ask you to work through this with us. So we're starting here with a specific recommendation. Again, to take you back to where we started, the recommendations are a broad, overarching recommendation. It's a starting point. And so what we want to work through with you all is coming up with a list of actions that, if executed, work to maximize the types of housing offered in Kyle. We've heard a lot of people say they want this, right? But in order for you all to do your jobs effectively, you can't just make it so. You need to have a list of items that you all can collectively tackle that make this work and make this start to happen. So we want you to think about this for a few minutes, and we'll give you a few minutes to think through it on your own, and then we will regroup and talk through some of these together. We'll ask you to share a few of your ideas. We're going to put them on the board up here, and then we're going to help you refine those so you can see what we've been going through in this process with your public, with your staff, and internal to our team. So think about this for about 5 minutes. Jot down 1 to 3 actions that are very specific, right? There are things that can be answered yes or no. We did them or we didn't, very definitively. They are things that are specific enough that when people read them, they can understand what the action is. These are some guidelines for you to think about. So 1, 2, even 3, if you're so inclined, jot those down, and we'll give you a few minutes, and then we're going to talk about some of the ones that you have come up with. So we'll give you just a few minutes to focus on that. Okay.
Yeah, could we have some examples of what it
Okay,
is
so
that-
we'll give you one example.
Okay, thank you.
Will you go back?
For me, I need the crayons and coloring book, please.
Just any one of these.
No, the one that we started with.
That says action types?
Right here. So, okay, so if we want to maximize the types of housing offered in Kyle, one of the first things that springs to mind for me is, do we allow different types of housing in Kyle? Do we encourage different types of housing? Have we defined what different types of houses are? Think about it from that perspective. If you were going to tackle this on your own, what are some of the first 2 or 3 things that you know that you would need to identify in order to make this happen? Does that help a little bit? And there's no right or wrong answers, so we're not going to grade anybody. We just want to get you thinking through the process. Okay, if you're still writing, feel free to keep writing. But let's talk through some of the ideas that you had. Does anyone want to share what you feel was probably your best item on your list of an action? Please.
Add infrastructure.
Add infrastructure. Okay. And we're going to jot down 3 or 4 of these, and then we're going to work with you to refine them. So that's a great suggestion. Okay. Anybody else want to share one? Yes, sir.
The same thing, referencing. Had the same issue.
Okay.
Road improvements to include also street and sign repairs.
Okay. Excellent.
Because we see a lot of that in the older neighborhoods.
Definitely. Okay. Anyone else want to share one? Please.
What about vertical mixed use?
Okay.
It's, enable vertical mixed use through coordinated revisions to the 4 zones that allow that kind of, which is MXD, CBD2, neighborhood, community, and community commercial.
You nailed specific, for sure. Okay, I want to make sure we capture that correctly. Enable vertical mixed use. Enable vertical mixed use in the 4
Through coordinated revisions to those 4 zone.
zoning districts. Okay,
MXD, CBD2, neighborhood, community, and community commercial.
perfect. Okay, excellent. Anyone else want to share?
So I had a few ideas around ADUs.
Okay, wonderful.
So on multiple fronts there. Let me see what those categories are. So from the regulation front, we could look at the zoning where we allow ADUs by right in certain types of zones. Education to citizens about how to get started, even going down that process of seeing if it's feasible for you. Education for banks in the local community about why they should fund that, because I understand that sometimes ADUs are not, like the loans for those aren't approved by banks because they're not familiar with them. And then lastly might be a financial or a process incentive where there's fee reductions or a fast track permit approval for ADUs.
You sound like you might have gone to a class recently where you learned about ADUs. You were a good student. Okay, fantastic. Okay, let's start. Oh, please, yes. We've got room at the bottom.
I think part of one of these things is, we talk about it a lot, but there's a trust but verify metric to it. Which is like, I'm thinking about is how do we make sure to our citizens that we're communicating these things. So I think a really big thing would having an annual report on the housing stock that's publicly available.
Like it.
So that way, as the city
Annual
council
report
is
on
getting
housing.
feedback, they can direct folks to say, this is what we're doing, and then they're gonna get better feedback in return, because they're
Fantastic.
matching what they're seeing and feeling with what they're seeing from the data.
Great.
That's true.
So already,
To
oh, yes.
piggyback off of that, I've actually heard that before from certain people that I actually work with that live in Austin. It's the common question that we always hear, hey, how much does it cost to live in
Sure.
Kyle? What are their schools like? Are they good? What's the average price? I think Councilmember Flores Kell brought that up. And one of her constituents, people were asking, hey, what's the going price for an average
Right.
home in Kyle? Okay.
Important
well,
decision-making
identify what an
factors.
average home is.
Sure.
Some of us look at it as 2,500 square feet. Some are like 19, some want $3,000.
Exactly.
So it's identifying those and seeing where we're at as a city, how we're growing.
Fantastic.
And to actually include, if I don't mind adding one more, when it comes to housing, affordable housing development, if it's a matter of finding builders to assist the city in those kind of projects, to where we could be able to have
Good point.
the affordable housing, who can the city reach out to, or if there's a developer or a builder that says, we are mainly focusing on affordable housing for first-time buyers in this area, and these are our plans, and this is what we like to bring.
Excellent. So you've already done some things that are really valuable here that I want to give you credit where credit's due. So one of the first things that you've already done well is you've gotten some very specific suggestions, right? That's always important, because how do you know if you've accomplished something if it's not specific enough? So you're setting yourselves up for success there. You've thought very carefully about steps that you have to take That's really a mind shift for some folks. We all think a little differently. We're all wired a little differently. So you've already tuned in on that. And you've started thinking about different elements. Some of you have thought about some of the different actions that we talked about earlier, right? So some of you have thought about this from a regulatory perspective. Some of you have thought about it in terms of education and communication. Some of you approached it through capital investment. So you are already innately doing this process that we're working through, which is really helpful for us. So this is a similar process that we typically take. So now let's work on refining some of these with you together. Let's start up top with the adding infrastructure. Some examples of infrastructure are road improvements and signs. So first question that we can ask ourselves, is this something that can be completed as it's worded, or is this a never-ending process? Right, because you can always add infrastructure, right? Okay. So how do we make this a little easier for us to report on? Is there a specific area that we want to start with as a priority? Is there a process that we want to use to look at where to add infrastructure? If we were to sit here today and say, okay, we have the ability to add that infrastructure, would we all know exactly where it needs to go already? Right? Okay. All right, so we need some more information, don't we? So what kind of information would be helpful to have to help make that decision of where that infrastructure needs to go? Connectivity, great point. Where do you have connectivity? Where don't you have connectivity, right? Okay. So that might be one specific action that we have, is we need to do an assessment to figure out where in Kyle that connectivity doesn't exist. Is that something that we can say yes or no, we've done it? We've identified it.
We've had some traffic studies done. You know, a lot of times we request it, a lot of times whenever it's an issue that we have from residents and so forth. So if it's something that the city could do as a whole to identify, and this goes back to where Zunika and I have been talking about, the regions of the city, you can actually see this specific region of the city in this area, let's say Goforth or 158 or whatever the area is, we identify it needs it more here, and then we can focus on this is where the projects are going to be handled. You know, this will be an 18-month project, and then we move to another section of the city.
Okay, so
versus, I guess, fixing this pothole over here or fixing that, which I think, you know, we're doing our best on. But I think if it's identifying the specific areas and saying, this is from this year, 2024 to 25, this region of Kyle is going to be mainly focused on the streets, redoing the pavements, redoing the lights, also doing a study to see, do those stop signs validated still, or do we need to get, let's say the word roundabout, or if we need to get actual street lights in there.
Okay.
And just identifying that area.
So what you've touched on is another important part of this is the how. So to identify where the infrastructure connectivity does not exist, a study would be a way that we could do that. So now we've added more specificity to that. We know how we're going to do it. We know what we're going to look for. So let's say that we've done that. We've completed a study. We've identified where that connectivity doesn't exist. What do we do next?
It also goes back to your first page of the general recommendations, aligning decision with community's principles.
Yes.
Right up there at number 1, where it says, use the annual budget report to show how the financial decisions, whether it's something like this, and priority align with this plan.
Excellent. You get an A+. So yes, so then we also have a mechanism to demonstrate that, and this is part of what you were talking about, to the community. So that's an important piece of this as well. So you guys are naturals at this. You may not even need us. I probably shouldn't say that, but okay, great. Let's talk about the second one for a minute. So what we started was enable vertical mixed use in those 4 zoning districts. And we need to do a coordinated review. And I'm assuming, and you tell me if I'm off base here, the coordinated review would be of the regulatory language for those zoning districts?
Correct.
Okay.
So by vertical mixed use, you know, commercial, on ground floor and then residential above. So that's
Okay.
one of those types of housing that we'd like to have.
Great. So,
Focusing
okay,
on
so we've
housing.
done something important there. We've defined a type of housing, which is important, so we know what we're talking about. We've started to narrow down where. That's very important to be specific. And we know that a review is the approach that we want to take. A review is something we can say, yes, we did it, no, we haven't done it yet, right? Okay, so that's all a really good start. So what's the mechanism? Well, I think every single time we've talked with you all, there's been one thing that has risen to the surface every time, and that is that you have said, we need a new code, right? We need a new set of regulations. So that would be the mechanism, unless you have another idea, that might be the mechanism for how we do a reevaluation of vertical mixed use and the permissions surrounding it. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, the zoning certainly is the mechanism, but before that, I think we need kind of guidelines, general
Okay.
guidelines on that. So for example, I was having a discussion with our director of planning about what it would look like on the ground floor. Should it be like continuous? Do we want continuous or just the corners to be commercial?
Mm-hmm.
How much commercial do we have to do? That has to be a little better defined in order
Okay.
to have a consistent look and feel for those areas that have this kind of vertical mixed use. So,
Great point. Okay,
I want to piggyback off that.
Please.
Say that, like, yeah, it's not just because we literally made a whole zoning district to encourage that kind of thing in MXD,
Yeah.
but it hasn't come to fruition in the way we thought it would. And so, yeah, I think we're realizing it's not just the zoning, it's the building code. It's all the small things in which come into how do I build this vertical mixed-use building.
Okay.
That developers might say, well, I want to do it a little differently. And we
Right.
need a way to have say, well, this is what we want to see.
right.
And get
So
that
you see
nice
how
middle.
you pull on the string, right, and it starts to unravel and there's all these pieces to it, right? This is why you guys get paid the big bucks, because this stuff is not easy.
Oh, I don't get paid.
You get all the good snacks anyway. Okay, so you've shared a couple of important things that I'm really glad were intuitive for you, because they're things that we would recommend you to think about. One of the important things that you said that was intuitive to you is we've tried something to get there and it hasn't been successful. That's really important. Maybe that's a first action here, is to look a little bit at why previous efforts haven't been successful. There's something to know there, and that could be very influential knowledge as you move forward into updating your code. So that's a really important piece. We're going to have to get Marshall a bigger whiteboard, I think. So that's really good instinct, I think. Another thing that you have naturally gravitated towards here is to think about where those things are appropriate. And you said guidelines, that's another action type, right? It's not just about regulating things, it's also about providing guidelines for where that's appropriate. Because you can't regulate everything as the only way to get it. You also have to provide guidelines to your development community about what your expectations are and what that maybe should look like, how that should be placed. So we might even split that into a couple of different actions where not only are we identifying those barriers, but we're also looking at guidelines to show where the placement of those things might be appropriate. You might even have an educational component of this, where once you've done that, you're making that information available throughout your community, and you're welcoming people into the conversation by letting them know how you've set those expectations.
I have a question.
Yes.
Now that you're talking about establishing some guidelines,
Mhm.
we're talking about maximizing the type of housing that we have. Is within those guidelines, could we establish something that, we request from a specific development to bring different type of housing, like, a percentage of, like, if you have done a percentage of vertical mixed use, then can you add 20% of townhomes and then do 25% of residential, like single?
To set a standard for diversity within that. Mhm.
Within the same neighborhoods,
Mhm.
not only have a type, like this is only for
Right.
vertical mixed use, but that same complex has
Yes.
different housing. That way, if they all enjoy the same amenities, and everybody could move to a place and have to choose from.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because there's a couple of different ways you could come at that. You know, one element of that might be educational. Is the development community aware of the benefits of having different types of housing? Does the community as a whole understand the benefits of maximizing the diversity in housing type? Do they understand how that can affect their bottom line, for example? We talked about how that has a fiscal element to it. Are there, to your point, regulatory tools that you can use? So as you can see, that's one idea, and there's lots of different ways that you can attack that idea, and the answer might be a combination of those. So that's a really good point. So those might individually be things that we look at too, is let's decide from a regulatory approach how we want to look at that, from an educational approach. Perhaps we want to do some assessment and use the fiscal analysis that you have now as part of this plan to help guide that decision. So those are three things that come from that one idea. So you start to see how this list grows, right? It starts small. So excellent discussion. Let's talk about ADUs for just a second. This is another interesting one. So we're starting out with saying allow ADUs by right. So as we start to think about what that looks like from a governance perspective, from a decision-making perspective, number one, is this something that we can say, yes, we did, or no, we didn't? Right? We're there, okay? So then another piece to consider might be, how do we do this, right? Do we do it through a Unified Development Code update? Probably. But keep in mind, too, that we're also writing this plan for the community, and they don't deal in zoning every day. So they might need a little more language to understand how you're going to do that, so that when you start about the business of doing it, it's not a surprise to anyone, right? They've been kind of prepared for that. So we might flesh this out a little bit just so they understand how you're thinking you're going to approach it. So it might be something like allow ADUs by right through amending zoning restrictions. Are there other, well, actually, these two actually go really hand in hand. So the next thing you said was educate the public on how they might build these ADUs. So let's think about that. Can we ever say that we've fully educated somebody, the whole community, right? That's kind of difficult, right? And I know you all are an ambitious group and you want to be able to report to the community, we've done this, we've checked this off, we're on to the next one. So how could we modify that where it's something that we can decisively say we did it?
Can we provide education pamphlets or tools to the public?
Okay, so we define the tool that we're going to use. That's a great way to do that.
So when they call, we can say, this is what it is.
Exactly. Okay, so you've defined how you're going to do it. Here's one thing we haven't talked about yet, which is also an important part of this process. Who does these things, right? So this is an important one that I think is a good example, so I'm glad it came up. We tend to do this thing when we do comprehensive plans in cities where we get tunnel vision because we feel like City Hall has to do it all, right? But we can't. It really requires the community to be part of this. So one of the things that you're going to see included in that plan is that inventory we talked about of local resources that your community has helped us identify. Are there any local resources outside of City Hall that could help with that effort? For example, one of the things that you mentioned was financial institutions, right? Could they be a partner in this effort? Would building a partnership with them help them be more receptive to this idea, where they could likewise provide counsel to you all on what limitations might exist? Are there any other local examples that you think could be? I'm sorry?
Real estate agents?
Okay, that's a great example. You have a local realtor community that's very knowledgeable about the market. They know what people are looking for, what the demand is like. They could be a great partner. So this is another important part of this, is thinking outside of ourselves even, how can we get the most done effectively? And so those are two great examples of local resources. You might just
Could
write
we
those on the
also
side.
look at working with our chamber?
Another good one. Yeah, another good one. So as we start thinking about these people, right, what do we think about? They have access to different networks than we might have. They have different ways of disseminating information than we might have. They can play different roles. One of the things that you'll see in the implementation strategy is we suggest the roles that local partners can play. Some examples of what I mean. One thing is you could use volunteer talent or expertise, right? Say you're trying to pursue a particular action and there are people in your community that are very knowledgeable about that thing. How could they be part of that effort? How could local resources help you promote an idea? How could they support an idea? How could the local development community perhaps invest in that idea and work with you to showcase it in some way, to pursue a project of that type? So that's another element of this that will encourage you to continue to think about. And as you're looking through the draft, that's going to be another thing that we want you to think about too, is how can we get these things done? You all are get it done people or you wouldn't be here. How do you get these things done? And those local resources are a really big key to that. Okay, so this is an excellent list so far. Let's talk about this annual report on housing stock. I really like this one too. So, annual report on housing stock. Is that something that we can report, yeah, we did it, no, we didn't? Yes, no, maybe, right? So let's unpack that for a minute. Can we say if we did it once, that was good enough? No, because we want it to be annual, right? So you were thinking about that when you gave us the language you gave us, because the intention is you've thought about the frequency with which it needs to happen. That's really important. It's important for a couple of reasons. It's important because identifying that intention and capturing it in writing is really important. It's important for your residents. If you tell them in this plan that you're going to do something annually and you've done it once, you're going to get a little credit. Do it twice, do it 3 times, guess what starts to happen, right? You're making believers of people. You're delivering that. So that's one reason that that's really important. Another reason it's important is because you want to make sure that the city staff is equipped properly to do the things that you ask of them. They can't do everything all the time. They never have enough resources, people, time, energy, money, etc. So the way that we go through these steps and the way we articulate them and word them is also helpful for them, because they are going to take budgeting cues from what you tell them in this plan. It's going to influence the way that they think about the size of the staff, the resources that they have at their disposal, the budget amounts that they need to set aside. All of these things really do work together cohesively, and you're fortunate that you have a staff that really understands how this plan is intended to be kind of an umbrella under which all of your different pieces plug in. And so this is also going to be very helpful for them. So let's talk about kind of the nuts and bolts of how we might come at this annual report on housing stock. Do we have all the information we need to just execute that report tomorrow? No, right? I doubt anybody at this table or in this room has all of that. Okay, so could this be a place that maybe there's an opportunity for local partnerships? Are there people in the community that might have information that would be important for this effort? We've already talked about the realtor community, right? Are there others that could contribute to such a thing?
I guess it would depend on what was in that report.
That's true.
And you have to define housing stock.
Okay. And another, to your point, to extend that even further, is what are we trying to do with this report? What's the purpose of it? Do we know? What do you guys think? What are we trying to accomplish by issuing this report?
Maybe we get information on what type of housing has been built.
Okay.
Maybe there's a starting point with what's available, and then the first year what's been built.
Okay. So
And then
kind
see what we want in the future.
kind of taking stock of what's here. What were you going to say?
I think also if one of our things is maximizing the types of housing offered in Kyle, the report also tells us, the goal is to say, are we maximizing that? Are there
Okay.
things that we are not building?
So maybe this
Where are
is
those
also a metric for us in a sense. It tells us if we're making progress or if we're being successful. That's really important to know.
So we need to identify the metrics, we need to track them, and we need to report on them. So really out of this, we've come up with 3 specific actions that we need to accomplish.
Now, this is the part where most people think to themselves, this is going to be a really long list, and how can we possibly do it all? So while Marshall's writing, let's talk about that for a minute. You can't do it all right away. And so this is where another piece that we've worked on with the public yesterday and last night is critical, and that we're going to work on with you all through the review of the document, and that is prioritization. We are going to talk in a minute about some of the challenges that you're going to face once you adopt the plan. And so that is one of the things that we'll have to think about. So prioritization is going to be really important. And in addition to prioritization is an understanding of how long things take. We tend to, as humans, underestimate always what things are going to take in terms of time constraints and resources. I think we all naturally do that to some extent. So this is also a really good time, and we're going to talk about how you are going to use this plan moving forward. It's a good time for you to have these conversations that are really important because they will set you up for success because you've actually unpacked all of these things. You've taken stock of them. You've talked about how you're going to accomplish them. And the added benefit of that is when you're doing that in a public setting, your community is going to start to take notice of that. Please.
To build on the last item, building the I guess housing inventory. Like, if the goal is to attract people, like, hey, I really want to move to Kyle, you know, I mean, because people that have been here forever, oh, we don't want a lot of people. And stuff. I mean, you're never going to please everybody. But like, so if we have an inventory of, hey, you know, we built in calendar year 2023 X number of homes, you know, in 2024 we have X number of homes in this area. In the west, you know, northwest part of Kyle, we're going to have X number of homes in this part. But I guess kind of, if, you know, it's all about, I mean, it's great to, we have housing, you know, build, build, build. But what about, you know, the homes that were built 5, 10 years ago, people have lived in there, where people are like, hey, I kind of, I guess something that on the city is like, hey, we get calls to repair this street. Was it addressed or not? So we'd kind of have an inventory of kind of the goals accomplished within the city department. Like, you know, hey, we got a call to repair a water main break on, you know, X street, you know, and it took us X days. Like that kind of stuff could be included in that inventory because it's not just about building, but it's like to attract the city. It's like, man, Kyle's doing a really good job. They're keeping track. I mean, it's not always going to be, you know, like, oh man, they responded in 5 hours I called or whatever. Was the customer happy? Hopefully they always say yes, but
Sure.
but I think that kind of thing would kind of where
I think that's an important point. So
What you're doing is you're already starting on the actions because you're identifying the metrics that we need to track.
Okay.
I mean,
Exactly.
That's absolutely, exactly. I mean, that's the way all of this process works. Like we talked a little bit earlier about incrementalism. Part of the reason, AJ was just talking about how we break this down, it seems like the biggest list on the planet, but the reason that it's big is because each part is small and each part is obtainable, right? But we have to know what our path is first. So we broke out Build a Report into these 3 pieces. We realized that we needed to identify metrics, and now we're starting to identify metrics. You know, once that's done, this one will be checked off, and we'll move on to the next, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, as we start completing all of these elements, we'll be able to look back and say, you know what, we are maximizing the types of housing in Kyle. So it's very exciting to hear you guys like working on the fly here.
taking it and running with it. Another thing that you, I'm sorry, real quick, let me make this point because I think it's important. You also touched on something else intuitively, which is important, which is maximizing what you can accomplish with a single action. So what you touched on is this thing not only is a reporting mechanism for us, letting us know how we're doing, it can also be a marketing tool. It can also be a way of communicating information to industries within Kyle. So you do one thing and it has multiple impacts, and that too is a really important part of this. I'm sorry, I just wanted to share that.
Meredith, do you want to go first? Oh, you had a question? Okay, well, just to kind of add on that, and I'll just be real brief. You're right, because it does give the metrics to developments around housing. And it also gives metrics for people who want to start looking at their property tax, you know, of the new houses are coming in. And it also helps identify probably for the school district to look to see where the housings are at, to see where the numbers are so forth, to see where it's coming from. So it could, all that
So that
combined,
benefit starts to
all
spread.
benefits to looking at it from me as a resident. I know I'm council, but me looking at the metrics, I can see the housing, how many apartments are coming in, how many apartments are not townhomes, areas that are being developed, so that way if there's bonds that come forward, whether it's road bonds or whether it's for amenities for the city or a school district, because you know they're starting to come every year now. So it helps the resident to look to see where the growth is, and especially for the housing, the type of housing and so forth.
Great point. Please.
Is this concept something that other cities currently do?
Successful ones.
Okay. I mean, to me, I mean, it obviously is very involved, and the amount of data that we would have to pull in from third-party resources seems very intensive, that it almost feels like this is a business idea that we all need to go into here and then replicate it, scale it across to other cities.
When you said are other cities doing this, were you referring specifically to a housing report of some kind?
Yeah, I mean, we have our Vibe Trail
Sure.
map, which is interactive,
Yeah.
and it tracks, you know, like what's being built,
Yeah.
what's being planned, approved, et cetera. And I just think all the information that we're talking about here is obviously very valuable to us as decision makers, but it's also very valuable to third parties who want to come in and make money off of residents in our city. And I think, and I'm just thinking this through now, like it probably creates competition within developers and holds them more accountable, which is a good thing, because they're going to want to be more targeted to fill in the areas in which we're missing diversification of housing. But my God, does this seem like this is an exceptionally large amount of work of trying to, because I mean, for me, I'm thinking like, why isn't this something that integrates directly into, what is it called? Into the MLS, where we're tracking in real time which houses are available for purchase, and, you know, so it's actually like, it's the information, people aren't getting information a year, you know, that's a year old when they're trying to make an educated decision. I mean, just think of what our housing market was like a year ago versus today.
Well, two things I want to point out. I want to make sure I answer your question, but I also want to be clear about the answer that I gave a moment ago, because I thought I was answering another question, which was that cities that take an incremental approach to implementing their comprehensive plans, those are the very successful ones. Some cities do track a great many metrics related to their housing stock. But part of what we are talking about here is what's really obtainable with the budget that you've got. And so part of the process of identifying metrics and then choosing to track them, you know, those things go together, because you find out, well, what can we really get data on affordably, quickly, reliably with the staff that we have? That's part of this process as well. So I think you're alighting on a rather fantastic business idea, but I also want to make clear that most of what we're suggesting here is couched under the assumption that we have to do the absolute best we can with the resources that the city has today. And we don't generally suggest, you know, over the top projects that we can't foreseeably say we're going to have this kind of budget available in whatever timeline is appropriate for it. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. One thing that's important about this process too, as you're thinking about the resources locally, it's perfectly okay to go through an idea process like this and reach the conclusion that perhaps the city's not the right entity to do it. Yeah. There might be a local resource, and perhaps you can be a partner to them by sharing some information with them, and they might be the best equipped to do that. So that's a perfectly acceptable answer. So I want to iterate that. And then I also want to mention that when you're trying to do these types of things, one of the things we mentioned when we were talking about the types of actions is that tactical community kind of incremental approach. And I mentioned at that point that experimentation is a really important thing. And so a big piece of advice that we give clients all the time is don't let perfection get in the way of good, right? Don't wait until it's perfect to do something. Have a bias towards action now. You can always refine and make it better later. So perhaps you take the very smallest step towards doing this thing, and you don't get it all accomplished exactly to the degree that you want to, but you get it started. And then the next year that you do it, it gets a little more comprehensive, and the next year you refine it a little bit more. So those things are really important too. I think we often feel pressure to have all the thoughts, all the possibilities articulated, and we've prepared for them, and we have, you know, thought of all the objections that could come up, and we get that analysis paralysis where we don't ever move forward. And so this is really helpful for that process as well, just getting started. You might talk to people in the community and they might say, you know what, we already have a lot of this information that you all want. We didn't know that anybody was really interested in putting it out. Or they might even say, we're kind of doing a version of this. Maybe we could talk about how to improve upon it. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you see the list starting to get long is you may not end up doing it all. Yes, sir.
Yes, we've been talking about maximizing and developing an action plan for housing. Put the thought out this way. Maybe there's, in some times, we need to minimize or control the type of housing. I'll give you the point that it comes to mind.
Okay.
Currently, there is a trend in finance and large builders to build large developments of build-to-rent homes on the scale of 800 to 1,000 homes in one place, or buying up existing stock in a particular neighborhood, large scale again. And it seems to me that we need good information as a planning and zoning and a council as well about these trends and how it applies to this community. Because being identified more or less as a bedroom community, being the third fastest growing town, over 50,000, we have a target on us for exactly that kind of housing development. And I would make the point here now that the reason we need to look at that is that I think it's something that could work against us quite badly to have 1,000 home developments that are all lease by one party.
Sure.
So perhaps research and recommendation by staff for council and planning and zoning, if that might be an action item on this particular issue.
That would absolutely be an action item here. Finding out, the information that you need to decide how to proceed, that's going to be a really important part. That's going to be an action you're going to see in a lot of things, right? You've got to get the lay of the land before you can move forward. You might need legal advice. You might need to talk about, different strategies. There might be different ways to accomplish the same thing. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Well, as I've often said, and I will say again, the developers are usually way ahead of us in terms of what they're doing and coming to us with. And I would like to see that we're not going to be on our back foot when we're dealing with these people.
Sure. Excellent thoughts. Well, you all have done a tremendous job on this, and you've given us some very usable things. And as you can see, we didn't have to spend too much time on this because you all were able to very quickly understand how to break these things into pieces. And that's going to be really important moving forward. So let's talk for a minute as we wrap us up tonight about what this looks like in the future. So you're going to see this graphic in the plan, and it's really important for a number of reasons. Now, the biggest reason is because if you want to avoid the curse of the comprehensive plan, right, where we have a lot of excitement, we get it done, and then, oh, it's that book that I never open. You want it to remain relevant. One of the main reasons that happens is because the plan is no longer relevant to the community. The community has outgrown it. So how do we prevent that from happening? We refine and update, and it's an iterative process that continues and continues, okay? That's really critical here. I think that this group in particular is really well positioned to understand this idea because of a few things that you've said to us. You've said to us tonight that you really understand this idea of taking recommendations and breaking them down into actions. You've shown us that. You've told us that you are very action-oriented and you're ready to get to work and get things done. And the implementation piece of that is all about getting it done. But what comes next? Well, we always have to be going through this process of assessing our needs. The needs of the community today are not always going to be the needs of the community a year from now or 2 years from now. And if we try to use this tool and it's cast in stone, it will become very irrelevant for you very quickly. And you all put a lot of resources towards financing this plan, and you've invested in it personally, and your community has invested in it. There's a lot of value built into this document, and so you want to respect that value and extend that value as long as possible. And the way that you do that is by continuing to have these conversations. We recommend, at least on an annual basis, where you're not redoing the entire plan every year. I don't want to scare you by saying that, but you're just having these conversations of checking in. Is it still meeting our needs? Are there areas where maybe it's not? Maybe we need to have a conversation about that. And you're engaging the public in that process. Another one of the worst things that can happen with these efforts is you have this big effort to have the community take surveys and come to meetings and talk to you about things. And then you adopt the plan and they don't hear anything from you again. And that's problematic. So they want to stay engaged. And some of the things that you've already talked about, reporting to them so that they can see what you're doing, having clear channels of communication where they can stay apprised as to what's happening, those are going to be really important things. And so this loop is going to continue, and it's going to be something that you all are going to be very much involved in. Your staff will lead you through this process on a regular basis. We're available in the future should you need us. But the truth is, and I'm probably a bad consultant to tell you this, you don't need us to do this. You are all well equipped to do this thing, which is make sure that the plan stays germane and relevant to what you're trying to do. So let's talk briefly about some of the challenges that are going to come out of this. And some of these I'm sure you've already thought of. Some of them may be things you haven't thought of yet. But there's kind of 5 different areas that we see challenges occur during the implementation process. The first one is one that is not going to be a surprise to any of you, and that is the challenge of trade-offs. There are going to be times where a choice is going to come between implementing this action or implementing that action. And you're going to have to decide in those moments which thing is most important and how to make that choice about what gets done today and what waits until tomorrow or another day. You're also going to face this issue with trade-offs where decisions are not always going to be understood by the community. You encounter that on a daily basis, I'm sure. But this is where this plan can be a resource for you. We had a really good discussion with the city staff this morning, and their team informed us about some of the things that you're talking about in your budgeting discussions, which are absolutely on track with what you want to be doing right now. And we talked about this notion that the plan is there for many reasons, but one of the things that it can do for you as a benefit is it provides you all a foundation to talk about and communicate why decisions are made. There are always decisions that people can't agree with or won't agree with. But typically, if people at least see that there was a process by which you reached that decision and there was some consideration, they can at least agree that that decision was not rushed into. They at least can see that you are going through this process of deliberation. So the comprehensive plan can be a guide to you, not only in your decision making, but then in defending those choices or establishing why those choices were made that way. Funding is always going to be a challenge as well. There's always going to be more demands than you have funding available. But as we talked about earlier, and you all had some really great ideas just off the cuff about how local resources could be used to expand your reach. That's going to be true in a number of areas. We have worked in a lot of smaller rural communities where you come into town and what you hear is, well, everyone knows everybody. There are no strangers here. And you know what we find every single time we work in those communities? The resources in that community were not connected. People always say, oh, I didn't know we had this group. Oh, I didn't know that this thing or this program was active, right? Doesn't matter how small it is. And so we can always be more resourceful with what we have in the community locally. And by having that focus that Marshall talked about, where we focus on a series of small steps, where we start to build traction and we build momentum. It doesn't have to be the biggest, grandest thing to be deemed an accomplishment, because forward progress is an accomplishment. Sequencing challenges are going to become present. You're going to look at the plan, we're going to make the edits that you advise us on, you're going to get it adopted, and you're going to think we got it all. And we got it all in the right order, in the right sequence, the priorities are there, and inevitably something will happen where you have a recognition of, oh gosh, maybe this thing needs to come before this. And that's perfectly okay, because conditions change and those things are going to happen. But the coordination of sequencing is something that's going to be really critical. And this is where your staff is going to be so valuable to you, because they're going to help you kind of look further down the road and see those things that are happening. And the likelihood of success is really important. Sometimes we have to have the discussion of what is the path in this particular issue that has the highest likelihood of success. It may not get everything that we wanted the first time, but we can achieve that thing, and then we can come back and take another run at this and get the next piece of it. Policy is also going to be another challenge. We talked about this when we were talking about neighborhoods and housing types and how to make those things go together. And I don't know if you'll remember this, but one of the things we talked about is that there's one certainty when it comes to development of housing, and that is if you don't allow it, it will not come before you for you to consider it, right? We talked about that certainty. And so a really important piece is having this check-in regularly to make sure that the policy makes possible the thing that you want to have happen. Because if it doesn't make it possible, it's already, that action that you've established is already dead, right? You're not going to get any traction on that. It also should encourage things. So when we talked about incentives, again, we always think of incentives as financial, but there's other ways that we can incentivize things. And we can use regulatory tools to encourage and inspire ideas, in addition to dictate and prevent and regulate. So that's going to be important for you all to think about when you go through this code update and other regulatory tools that you want to revise or bring on board. Another thing about policy is that's usually where the pushback happens the most, right? Those are the meetings where people are going to show up. Those are the meetings where you're going to hear public comment. As well you should, because that's the whole reason that we do these things in public. But this is where, again, having that plan as a foundation that you can point to, it's challenging, but it is much less challenging than you having to feel that you need to defend a decision with nothing to point to that backs you up. So one thing that we've talked with your staff about is making sure that we not only don't contradict some directions that they're already moving in, but that we build in support for them to do those things. Likewise, the same is true for you. And then data is the last piece. And we talked about this with some of the actions that you gave us on housing. Data is not always present. Sometimes it has to be sourced. Sometimes we have to get creative about how to source it. I promise you your staff is super creative when it comes to these things. So if you're not sure, but you have an idea of what you're wanting to get done, trust them. They can help you understand the best, most efficient and economical way to get that data. And then it's really important to establish who's going to collect it. Who's responsible for that? Who's responsible for providing it? How does the sharing occur? That's another thing we see with a lot of communities that feel like they're really well connected on the front end, is they start to find these different silos where there's data that is in people's possessions and in different groups' possessions, and it's not being shared and shared alike, and that can be very powerful. So these are some of the challenges that you'll face in implementation. None of them are insurmountable. They are all made easier with an adopted document. Yes, sir.
I know all 5 of these things are a lot about flexibility and growing that indoor thing. I think one of the biggest concerns I have coming from just how I know the city to operate in recent history, not exactly fairly recent history, but over a good 10, 15, 20 years. Mm-hmm. How do we also ensure the plan goes from council to council well? Even through turnover? Because I know how much it takes to win a Kyle City Council election. It's not that many votes compared to a lot of other places.
Yeah.
So I could easily see a situation in which someone's unhappy about something, gets some people, and one of those values, i.e. maybe financial stewardship, becomes more important than all of those other values and delivers something in which we cannot achieve the rest of these things because we have maximized financial stewardship.
Right.
So I guess my thing in implementation challenges is making sure we build a plan that is sustainable through those changes so that we can actually achieve these things and leave what we want to instead of leaving something that can easily just be piled over.
Excellent question. So there's a lot of different pieces to that answer. Number one is you make sure that the plan remains updated and relevant. Right? It's easy to come into office and discard something when it's not relevant to what you're doing anymore. No one would really question that. So that's number one, is make sure that what you're handing off is still as relevant as it was when you adopted it. Another piece of that is some of this exercise that we went through here. There were a lot of benefits of it. That's another benefit. There's clarity in what was adopted. There's clarity in the work plan. When plans stop with those broad overarching recommendations, it's left up to each individual elected official and appointed official and staff member and city manager and so on and so forth to interpret what those broad recommendations actually mean. And if we threw one of those out here on the table and asked you all to write down what it meant to you, and then we compared notes, we would get so many different versions of an answer. That's just human nature. So by being as abundantly clear as possible, where we can show them these actions, and whoever's coming in can understand what was meant, why it's there, how it's achieved, all of these things, that also is a really important piece of how you do that. Yes, ma'am.
So I just wanted to point what you said is super important. I think that it will be a great way to engage planning and zoning in the city council if we were to have, I don't know, besides this type of meetings, a joint meeting twice a year to make sure that we are following through with the plan that we're establishing, and we are like, making sure that we're not getting out of the way with the plan, but making sure that we are keeping accountable with what we are agreeing to do.
So 2 things that you said are really important. You're communicating clearly. That's really important. You might even start thinking about those transitions when they're coming and making sure that you're getting everyone in a room, people that are outgoing and people that are incoming, and so they're talking to each other. Another thing that you said is really important is accountability, right? If you're coming into a work group that has done a really effective job in identifying what they're going to do, they're showing that they're doing it, and they're reporting it to the public, who wants to come in behind that and not be effective, right? Everyone wants to be effective. So you're setting and establishing this bar of how these boards and committees and council operate, and that also helps with continuity. So that's another really good, I'm glad you shared that.
I was just going to sort of expand a little bit on this concept that you see up on the board here, on the screen here, which is that when you do have new people coming in, people decide to become involved in cities for all kinds of reasons, but they often have particular subjects which they're very passionate about, and I've never met a single person who tried to get onto a city council who didn't care just so much about the place that they are. So you can get good stuff from everybody. This process, what it does is it allows new folks to have some say in the way things that are going forward in a way that is conducive to the overall environment of city operations, right? So adding new actions as new ideas and new problems are presented is a net benefit to your community. Refining recommendations over time and refining actions as the facts on the grounds change should be looked at as a positive thing if it's not being done to, give the squeakiest wheel some grease, but instead to actually try and bring the community more in line with the goals that it has identified, which will be clearly outlined in the plan itself. So looking forward to these changes is a positive thing. This should not be frozen in amber when it gets published. The entire point is that it updates, that we want new ideas to come in and operate through this process, not out of alignment with this process. The actual engagement needs to happen after we've assessed needs. The new recommendations need to be drafted and thought of cogently. Actions need to be created that are in line with those recommendations. If that process is followed, new people coming in will find themselves also wanting to make the entire plan successful as well.
And that leads to number 3 now, defining the gold standard so that residents, developers, and businesses and others, council members, boards and commissions, everybody else on board, knows what it means in Kyle and knows and how it's applied.
That's been probably the number one repeated thing.
These were the things you had. Your annual report shows the finances, developing the assessment to impact and make the key decisions on the projects and policies. And then number 3 is exactly what he's stating. Whenever we move on, that the new people that come on board understand where we originally came from and to continue with that. And to go back to where it says, okay, if we're doing this gold standard, we're doing that. Part of the analysis is that you also do a completion of what's been done.
Right.
So we can go back and the residents can actually see, these were the projects that were done. These were the ones that were actually completed. And these were the dates, and this is what it was.
And what do you normally hear from residents, right? I don't know what's going on.
I don't know what's going on.
I don't know what their priorities are.
I didn't know this was going on.
I don't know when this is going to
I didn't know the streets
happen.
were closed. And so by talking to a resident at the comprehension, at the thing the other day, I actually mentioned to it, if we send out flyers, if we put in the free press, if we send you mailers, would you read this? And he's like, well, maybe some of the older folks might. But again, Tobias, we are still in the digital age where I get all my stuff from here. And so again, it's still working on how we can communicate even better
Sure.
and then building from there and
That
then
was
get
your
an
point, too.
analysis and so forth.
Can I just piggyback off some of these
Please,
remarks?
yes.
One of the things we've created for us is, for ourselves, is an ordinance that says every 10 years, we do a comprehensive plan. And maybe that's the wrong model. Because I did look at the old one and I looked at it and said, well, that's not going to work. That doesn't work for today's Kyle. And so maybe we need a different ordinance or a different manner to do that. And picking up what Councilwoman Parsley said, perhaps council, of course, has the opportunity to have a special committee. And so maybe once every year, once every 2 years, you could have an ad hoc committee for comprehensive plan review. And then we don't have this every 10 years, a big thrash to try to create a new relevant plan.
Well,
Something like that's in the charter. We just got
okay. And another benefit of doing it that way
Yeah, but it
is
doesn't have to be done once every 10 years.
correct. It doesn't have to be a huge overhaul. You're making incremental updates to that plan, and that's really important. And another thing I just want to leave you with too is we have to kind of shift the way that we think about this process, and you all are doing a great job of just leading us down that road. And one of the things that's really harder sometimes to grasp is that sometimes those updates in the plan are going to be checking off things that you've accomplished, right? And those are wins and they need to be celebrated and you want to share that information. However, it is also okay when sometimes those updates are to say, you know what, this is no longer a priority for us, or we tried that and it didn't really work. And so that's not the way that we need to do that. Because you know what that does, right? That makes you all human, right? It helps your community understand that you're thinking carefully about what's in the plan, and it's not just about achievement and re-election and all of these things that are usually thrown out there when we're doing these types of things. But sometimes it's just about making sure that we're still on the right track. And sometimes that means we take things out, or we reduce the scope of things, or we say, you know what, this just isn't a priority today, and so we're not going to focus on it. And those changes are just as meaningful, and there is no failure when you make those changes. So this isn't one of those things where we want to pump you up and make you feel that you have failed if you decide that you need to make some of those changes or something doesn't work out. That too is part of that process of experimentation, and just trying it is just as important sometimes. So I think you all are on the right track and really well equipped to do this, and we're excited to see where it goes. You've all been very patient with us with your time this evening. We're very appreciative of it. I don't want to take any more of it out of respect for you. We will be here if you'd like to ask some questions or visit with us. We're happy to do that. But I think you have knocked out of the park what we asked you to do very succinctly. And if any of you are ever looking for a job as a consultant, let us know, because I have a place for you. So just to really quickly recap what's going to happen next, you will have a draft that's going to be coming to you by the end of this month. That's going to be the first big piece of the plan. The second big piece of the plan, the implementation strategy that we talked about tonight, that will be a deliverable that you'll see a draft of in August. And then we'll be visiting with you to refine that draft and be ultimately presenting that to you on our next trip. So the next time that we see you all in person, we will be presenting this thing to you all that we've all worked on together. And that's very exciting. So thank you for your time and attention.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Just a quick request. We asked everybody to come up with some actions. We got to talk about a handful of them. Anyone who would like to and is willing to share the other actions they jotted down, if you'd give them to me, we'd really appreciate it. We'll look into those as well as we're working on the implementation portion of the plan.
Thank you. Okay, so this item here was for discussion on this end. Do we need to go ahead and look at another date right now to come back? I think it's between August, September, or we want to wait for them, Will?
I'm not sure, sir. We'll take a look. I think we may have another date scheduled, but
Okay.
we'll get back to you and let everyone know.
Okay. With that, I don't see anything else. If we need to go into executive session, we don't? Okay, so if that's the case, does anybody else have anything that they want to add? If not, I'll go ahead and make a motion to adjourn the meeting. Second, and we are adjourned, and planning and zoning is next.
Oh, good, my mic wasn't on. I mean, I would say, since there's no further business and we've completed the agenda, I would make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Perfect, we're done.
All in favor? Aye. Have a good evening, everyone. We're adjourned.